I'm Jan Visser, and I'm meeting here at his home with Paul Heckman, a professor at the University of California, Davis. And actually, but the reason why we're meeting obviously is because we, Learning Development Institute, are producing a book on seeking understanding, and we invited various people to contribute to the book. You're one of them.
Very thankful.
I had asked you to write about your experience in facilitating the setting up and evolution of an innovative school in West Sacramento. So that's an experience that you have. I happen to have similar experience myself from my background, so we're basically talking about similar things that have happened in different countries, in the US and for me in Europe and in Africa. In bringing about reform in the school system, it isn't easy, is it?
No, it's not. Well, it's interesting. I think our conceptions of what it means to bring about what you call reform, I think has to be rethought, in that it's a longer term development of, at least at a school, of a group of people who are called teachers and principals and students. And as Seymour Saracen used to say, it's not like 1 + 1. It's far more complex, and it also is far more, I think, involving of relationships, so that people trust each other, but they also trust myself as an outsider, that I don't have a motive other than to be there with them and to participate and raise questions and speak whatever thoughts I have, and they in turn are able to do the same. And I've always tried to make clear that they remain the deciders. I can't decide for them, but I will raise questions, I will push, and of course that means it takes a very long time. And
can anyone in particular decide, or should we rather look at it as an evolutionary process taking place within a community of people?
I think
where it's the community actually.
Yeah, it's the community, but clearly the way power works or influence works among the staff, there are some key people that are more appear to be more influential than others.
Like in any evolutionary system, of course.
Yeah, and we've tried to think about it as the school as a culture. So it's the shared mental models.
So one has to be aware actually of that existence of it being a cultural process.
Right, which is why we then have spent a lot of time on what we call dialogues, where teachers together, those who want to, and usually it's everybody, but it doesn't have to be, because the so-called cultural concept means they will be influenced even if they don't want to be. Do it.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of working with together this group of people to first start making clear what are they doing explicitly, and then why they do those things, so that they also find out, while they think they are uniquely contributing, which they are, but they start finding out they have similar both practices and underlying explanations. And it's those then that we have tried to start working with. But
no, go ahead.
No.
For the benefit of the viewers, let us start defining what we're talking about.
Yes.
And actually, when what got us into touch with each other was our meeting in Indonesia, in Lembang, when we were running the Building the Scientific Mind colloquium there.
Yes.
And you explained the experience during the colloquium.
Yes.
Subsequently invited me to visit a school in West Sacramento, California.
Mm-hmm.
So can you very briefly describe sort of the formal process of the start of that experience?
Sure. I mean, as much as I can remember.
Yeah.
I had come here from Seattle, from the University of Washington,
Mm-hmm.
and had some experience with the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, which was being funded by the Gates Foundation, because I was working with what was called then a middle college high school campus school on the University of Washington campus, and met the person who was involved in this Woodrow Wilson. And when I then moved here, he had gotten some additional attention from the Gates Foundation, and he called me and said, what are you doing, and would you think about establishing something? And I already had been. I mean, I throughout my career, I've always tried to spend time in a school, even though I'm a faculty member. I think my work is out in schools and communities. So I said, yeah, that would be an interesting idea. So I talked to our dean, and we started putting together a small group of faculty, just because you have to get faculty together, and then made contacts, and finally found in West Sacramento at least a district that was somewhat interested. And we were also then working with a charter school, a CMO, a charter school management organization called Aspire. But as we worked with them, he finally said, look, I think, why don't you just work with the district, because we'll be a middle person. So that's what started, and we then put together Sacramento City College and the district, and then UC Davis, to create what's called an independent charter, which is allowed in California. And
was the choice of West Sacramento deliberate, or was it just the opportunity that arose?
No, it was deliberate, because the other thing that I've worked on all my career, I think, is working with with children and students of color who are economically poor. Some people like to think about low income, but these families were poor.
They're immigrant families.
Usually they've been immigrant, in this case mainly Latino and Latina, but there were Spanish speaking, and in this community there were also some Russian speaking families who had immigrated. So
the literacy level in English was low?
It was low, and these kids in particular, and the reason we went there, and the reason there was some interest in a middle senior high school, was because the kids were not, those who were economically poor were not doing well in the middle school, and then high school, the dropout rates were similar across California. When color and poverty come together, it's not a pretty mix. So we talked about really recruiting those who were the poorest, meaning in economic terms, not in assets, but in economic terms, and whose families had no experience in going on to post-secondary. And then we put together a charter. It was accepted. We put all this language about trying to be innovative, and nobody think they knew what that meant, but they gave us permission, and we had it approved, and then we started recruiting students. And because there was ill will, or at least not positive feelings about the middle school, we were starting with middle school kids, and the idea was we would do so-called 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students, and each year then add a year. So
I see.
Actually we started with 6th and 7th, and then the next year those 7th and then we bring in a new group.
Okay. Yeah.
And then as we got into the dealing with older kids, more and more high school kids from different places who hadn't been with us at first wanted to come because they had not been successful.
And they were attracted to what
and they
read
wanted
about
to
it.
be, I think they heard they
Yeah.
might possibly be successful.
Mhm.
And so we ended up with a group of kids, young people who typically would not have been successful in school.
Yeah.
Oh, they were very successful with us, and I mean, some of them, of course, would have been successful in regular schools too. But
Was it immediately set up according to a particular vision that
No.
had been there? Or?
no, well, in the stuff we wrote, we certainly talked
Yeah,
about
of course.
trying,
Has to.
as you would have to. But
Yeah.
as I told the teachers when we started, we were not coming to them with a package of things.
Mhm.
We were going to start with what they had in their minds and what their actions were, but we had hopes that, I mean, you can, and we've done that in the chapter too. I was never quiet about naming the regularities. Children sitting and listening,
Yeah.
not a good thing.
I read that in your chapter.
Yes, right, and
you know, it comes back.
right, and having a long list of things to be learned
Yeah.
didn't make sense. But most importantly, the question was, why weren't these kids being successful? And a conclusion, I think, that through reading, and the teachers were very willing to do that when we'll get to the dialogues, but it was clear that if they could get motivated and engaged, they would learn. And the trick wasn't that they can't learn, the trick was they weren't motivated. And so we started working on what's involved in motivation. So one of the books we first read was Daniel Pink. He had one called The Whole New Mind, but the other one was about motivation. And it helped give us terms to talk about. And because that usually was an issue that came up in these dialogues, and the dialogues were things that I did say we had to have those. And these were meetings at first once a week for 2 to 3 hours. So we would meet after school and probably until 5:30 or thereabouts.
There are regular views of learning, and there are alternate views of learning.
Yes.
Right, and you probably started off with teachers who held the regular views.
Oh, they did. They thought memorizing, they thought, and then they thought motivation had to do with the kids just having the discipline
and teaching the necessary
and conveying factoids.
For learning.
And that was, and we would talk often in the dialogues about that and why did they believe it, and that started to raise questions about that. But the other thing we did, we also then went back and would try things out after a so-called dialogue. So a dialogue usually happened, I think, on Wednesdays, but I don't remember. And then until the next Wednesday, teachers, we talk about, well, what would they either try out or go talk to kids about. So one of the biggest things usually that we start off with, it just happens, it doesn't matter if it's the elementary level or the secondary level, that these kids don't know anything. So that's the explanation for why they don't do well, because if they knew it, then they would do well. So we would, in those first early weeks, I'd say, so why don't we go back and when you have an opportunity, sit down and ask kids what they know. And do they know anything? Because the argument you're making, they know nothing, well, then they should tell you they know nothing.
Yeah.
But they started finding out they knew, but they were things they were interested in. They were not the things in the classroom. So that's how, and then they'd come in and they'd share what they learned from the students, and that helped us start getting traction that they could think differently and act differently. And lo and behold, things shifted a little bit. Now, it usually took a while, because, for example, one of the things that I recall that kept teachers from really branching out is there were tests every spring. And even though the kids didn't do well on the test, the teachers thought they had to still keep doing the regular stuff so they didn't do worse on the test. And so we would explore, even go so far as what's a test and all of that. But it wasn't until early spring, when the test had been given, that I then said, well, look, the test's over. So how about if we have 6 weeks or 8 weeks before the end of school? How about if all of us try something? And so lo and behold, one of the things we tried was,
as an add-on to the regularities.
And to not do the other things,
Yeah.
because I thought, well, you don't have to keep doing everything else since the tests are over, right?
Right.
So we then said, why don't you go back and ask the kids what they're interested, both what they know and what they're interested in. And we had done some of that, but now it was possible to say, so suppose we let that shape what you're doing, with different groups of kids working on things they were interested in, and eventually trying to get the kids and the teachers to say, so what's your question? What are you wondering about here? Rather than I'm interested in bluebirds or on volcanoes, because they're all familiar with that in school. It was, so what do you really puzzle over? And they had a lot of puzzles. And so rather than saying, well, let's just go look it up in a book, although they could do that, let's try some things out. Go talk to people. Go interact with something. And a couple of things they found out in those, this is interesting, but that 2 things happened. They actually first saw that the discipline, and there used to be issues of discipline in those first 2 years, the kids would not just sit still quietly because they weren't engaged. And what the teachers noticed was a lot of that stuff disappeared as kids were doing stuff they were interested in and had questions about. And the other thing I think they found out is these kids could actually figure out things. They didn't have to be told, they actually could when they had the interest and the question. Now, what's interesting from my point of view, at the end of the year when we went to start the new year again, even though I would remind them of our success, and they would remember that too, that kids were engaged, there was less so-called discipline. But then they came back in the fall and said, but now we have these tests. And so we went through a similar set of what I call dancing. But each time we're exploring more and more, reading more, trying to have better explanations for what you talked about, what's learning, and finding out learning is not mechanistic. It has to do with that individuals have the schema in their minds. Those are constructed, they're developed over time. I always tell not only them but other groups, at least from what I've learned about the brain, not the mind altogether, but the brain, right? It has 100 trillion neuronal connections, and what I would say, that's a bunch. And and even if there's some what I would call neural disruption, even if you're short a couple 100 million, it's not a terrible thing.
It's as complex as the universe itself.
It's very complex, very adaptive, and therefore it was always, we finally arrived, it's silly to say these kids don't know anything. They know a lot of things, and so we were able, as we did more and more of this reading and starting to confront more, why were they still insisting on identifying things for kids and that sort of thing. It was finally at the end of the second spring, just to get to the point, we again went through this, what do you have to lose now, the tests are over. But I finally said, look, it seems to me we've now had 2 years, the previous year, spring, and now this spring, we see when the kids are doing something they're engaged by. How about if we just started the year off knowing we're going to organize, and one thing that had come up, probably because the literature and also my own experience, we also started thinking about grouping the kids differently than by age. So by that time we would now have 6, 7, and 8th grade, and I think we were going to, no, that's what it was, 6, 7, 8, and we were going to add, now we're going to start a so-called high school group. And the suggestion was, why don't we just organize them in multi-age groups? So have... According to what criterion would you... They're just mixed kids, mixed age, because there's no...
So it would be randomly mixed?
Yeah, in general, that there'd be 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds at that time. And we had tried some of that out earlier in these couple of years. Just say, what would happen if we... And it was clear that the older kids, and this is true in the literature too, the older kids started to be much more self-regulating because they then would want to remind the younger ones how to behave. And then, so...
It's like a family.
Like a family. And so lo and behold, again, we started seeing that the so-called behavior that was used to happen all the time with kids acting out, because they were engaged and they were in interactive group settings and they were working on projects, and sometimes these projects flopped, and during the dialogues the teachers would come in and complain about 2 or 3 kids who were being squirrely and not doing what, but we went through, what do we know about motivation, what do we know about their interests, what do we know about what do they know, and let's sit down and figure that out. So eventually then we were in multi-age groups, and the other thing is the teachers, because we were having these weekly dialogues, thought it was very important to work more together, so we teamed them up too. So instead of one teacher being responsible for a group throughout, now 2 or 3 teachers would be responsible for a larger group, and they would decide how to move them around amongst the 3 of them. So it didn't have to be all 8 teachers.
And their roles would be determined either by a particular discipline?
We tried, they would be, the way I thought about it, they would be worriers. So somebody who, like Eric, you remember Eric, he was interested in science, so he was the worrier for science. Now, this is where the regularities of the mental model of school came. When it got to the high school, and we had more and more kids of high school, it was very difficult then for the teachers not to think of themselves as, I'm the English teacher, dude. I'm the science teacher. And we struggled with that, because that's what you do in high school. And the other thing is the reality of high schools there, which we started to address. There is this issue of credits. You can't, at least in U.S. schools, you can't graduate from high school unless you have X number of credits, which is equivalent to seat time. I mean, how much a friend of mine calls it BIS, butt in seat.
Right.
But that is was the fly in the ointment, because then if you have credits, you have to give grades. You couldn't, because those have to be recorded as grades. And so through the 8 years we contended with credits, grades, what's required. But that's what the dialogue's for, and that's why I said it took a number of years for people to begin to have, in this case, as we think about the learning, new developing schemata about learning and about children and about what the stuff was. And that's why we also then started coming up with what we called our habits of mind, about how do scientists in this case do their work, not what are the particular things that scientists learn, but how do they do their practicing of science. And part of that argument was there's all this so-called information and knowledge. Why are we going to select just some things? Why not let the kids, given the importance of interest in what their prior knowledge is, let's start there. So we started trying to shift our understanding of these ways of knowing and let that be the focus. But we still had to contend with this credit issue and grades.
Over the time that we as an institute have been working on the issue of building the scientific mind, we sort of evolved in our way of thinking about it. It's not just that you want other people to acquire the habits of the scientists when they are practicing their science, but rather to become part of a culture of ways of being in the world that are in that case based on the experience of how do we get to know things, how do we find out, how do we understand.
Well, and Jerome Bruner talks about something he calls learning to be. Learning to be a scientist, learning to be a historian is important. The other thing is that doesn't mean students or scientists aren't learning this is Ryle's word, that they do have particular things they learn, but they're not the same things that everybody else is learning if they're pursuing a question and undertake. But if they're in a group, which is what we continued, they are sharing that. And so we also, I mentioned that in the chapter, we also had these public performances where the kids each quarter would come and present their investigations to their peers, and sometimes parents showed up and other people, and then the peers would ask questions like, how did you know that? How did you come to that? What do you so there was sharing, but it wasn't the same thing as arguing. There were just certain that all the students then would know. But
it's important in today's world that we also learn to think not only within the boundaries of our own interests and discipline, but beyond it. And I think that process that you're just describing seems to be very crucial, actually, to developing yourselves in a way to be able to do that.
That's right. Well, and also helping the young people, the students, but everybody else know that we weren't the first person in the world to ever think this. And so there are other people, what some people call standing on the shoulders of giants, but or even little people. But what do we know?
Newton's expression.
Yes, that's right. So but then every time we made advances like this, it then challenged what is usually gone on. And in the U.S. in these last 10 years with the combination of the standards movement and NCLB, No Child Left Behind, and testing, the degrees of freedom that the larger policy community and regulatory community wants to give a local student, especially when this so-called Common Core came along,
Right.
it just closed in, and despite everyone said, well, this will allow each place to do what it wants to do, the expectations from the state, from WASC and everything else, there were particular that's
Mhm.
that the tests were going to tap into, and that regulators were going to expect. If it's going to be tapped into by the test, then the assumption was teachers should be teaching it and students should be,
Should be
for
tested.
want of a better word, knowing it, but they really meant memorizing it.
Yeah. I've heard it being referred to as no child left untested.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And for the students we had, who were very smart, but
Yeah.
their experience did not match those of upper middle class kids, and therefore they did not do above average work on above average scores, but they would score close to the mean. Now, that was the other thing that was very frustrating. One would expect, given the way these tests are, that the average would be what you would think
Yeah.
would be acceptable.
Mhm.
But given this push to have everybody above average, they mean scoring above average. They weren't being seen as above average, but the test scores, it made it such that the criticisms of those outside would always come to, so what are the test scores?
Yeah.
Well, they're close to the average, but and in some cases below, because that's what you'd expect relative to
Yeah.
the stuff.
But you're referring to the experience, and that is probably part of the problem, that those tests, not perhaps not deliberately or consciously, they probably reflect the average experience that middle class people would have.
You bet.
So if the tests were designed on the basis of another assumption of what is the experience that forms the background of the learning of people, it might be a reverse picture.
Yeah, well, I think so. But that's why we went to these more performance-oriented assessments, where we said, I mean, the irony with testing, right, it has to assume a distribution because of the statistics that are being used. If we don't want to mess with distributions, then our way was saying, like we do in a PhD exam, we don't put them all up in front and say, now compare them. We instead have each student provide their dissertation study, the faculty query them and decide
their ability to defend.
To defend the evidence and the methods and everything else. It seemed to me that made sense for middle and senior high school kids.
Sure.
They should have to defend, but there should be criteria. That's why we had habits of mind. We had these ways of thinking, and kids had to then talk about what was their evidence, what were their analytic skills, and that they were coming.
Talk of habits of mind, critical thinking.
Yes, yes, and also, I mean, it seemed, as you and I were talking informally before we started, when we had visitors, usually, who came either from the California Department of Education or the mayor or whoever it was, Muriel and others came and visited too, they were quite taken by the way the kids could express themselves, the work they were doing, the teachers' enthusiasm for it all.
We were flabbergasted, actually.
When
we saw it, and even more so when I revisited the school after its demise, and I had the opportunity to still talk to students who had gone through that experience and we're thinking, we're reflecting on what it had been in comparison to what it was then.
Yeah, as it was returning back to a school.
Because that's the second half of the story, of course, of the evolution of that school.
That's right.
That it didn't go on. So tell us what happened.
Well, writing the chapter, which I appreciate the invitation, but it was very difficult because without getting too personal, but I also came down with multiple myeloma cancer during the year 2014, which did not allow me to keep doing the dialogues and to separate from going to the school. And that was exactly at the same time that a new principal started. Now, the previous year, the board, I think, because of all the changes, the multi-age, the working, the focus on habits of mind and everything else, it was clear to outsiders that these kids were engaged, and we had our first class going off and graduating, and actually we had, I think, may not have the exact numbers, but 6 or 7 that went to a UC campus, UCLA, UC Santa Cruz,
University of California,
various locations, and then others who were accepted at a Cal State system. So we had a number of the kids accepted, and then those who weren't were going into the military, or a couple wanted to go and do cosmetology or something like that. But in general, they all had post-secondary destinations. That's what we said we wanted to do. But during that year before my cancer, the board started asking questions. I don't know what precipitated it, but they accused the principal then, who had done a wonderful job, her name was Yolanda, that she was mismanaging the school and administratively off. And
administratively off.
Yeah, she didn't have fire drills in the way, I have no idea why fire drills became such a big deal, but they did. And she was also having some surgery on her knee, and she was out for about 6 weeks, and the board at that time conveyed to her in a letter that they were investigating her. And so she had an opportunity to go, and she's still there at another district, as a district level administrator. And so in late February, she announced she was leaving, and she left. That meant the school now had no principal, and the board was getting squirrely. So one of the teachers, Liz, took on the role of acting principal, and we continued with our dialogues. But the board then sought a new principal, and while I spoke up for one of the candidates that was very much interested in keeping things going differently, the person they chose said she knew school. And so they hired her, and my first couple of meetings with her in July, before I was diagnosed, were a little tense. But I thought, well, we're going to have dialogues, and she'll come along. Well, I was diagnosed in August, and underwent a lot of chemotherapy, and could not then go to the school. I mean, my immune system and everything else was low, so I did not go back to the school to start working. They tried to keep the dialogues going, but this principal in those dialogues didn't want questions asked. She wanted commitments made to bringing the school back. And eventually, I think I report in the chapter that at the end of that year, her first year as principal, almost all the teachers were either let go or sought a new job. so by the following, was that when you came, or was it the next year? It was the next year. I'm sorry.
I still spoke with her, the
Yes,
new
right.
principal.
Yeah. So that was the year. That was
yeah,
that.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
so. That was it.
But
year,
by the end of that year, she had cleaned out, or had the teachers leave,
Mm-hmm.
because they were not settling for just bringing the school back to an old school. But so she let them go, and then ironically, the next year she started working on a new charter, so that the school now is what's called a middle college school, and it's no longer an independent charter having its own board. It's instead a district dependent charter, and it's only a high school. So as we had done when we were there, kids were taking college courses even while we were there, but this new one, they will take more of their courses at Sac City, so they say. I haven't followed it. But there was, in my view, a real effort to get the school back
into the regularities.
Because I think given today's environment with NCLB and standards, to be that far away from things brought a lot of anxiety on for board members, for policymakers. I mean, I remember, and I will not name the person, but a person from the California Department of Education who came in and saw what was going on, was impressed by it, but then tried to say to us, because the question the board asked is, what do we do about raising the test scores?
Mm-hmm.
And her main suggestion was teach
To the test.
to the test, but her notion was teach to the content standards, but that's another word for teach to the test, and that was something, at least when we were there, we were not going to do. I mean, National Academy, any number of groups had said that's a corruption of testing, but nonetheless, that was the expectation, and so the hope, I think, of and that's why I, in the chapter, talk about, I think the biggest impediment we have are the mental models that policymakers, educators have about the regularities. These are taken for granted. As Dan Lorty talked about it many, many moons ago, each educator, each policymaker has had an apprenticeship in schooling. They start out at 5 years old, they graduate from high school, still in the midst of these regularities, and then they go to the university. It'll be one thing if they are really engaged in the university as a scientist or historians, but they're still sitting in seats, butt in seat, receiving information and conveying it back. But the mental model is still there. That's what
the mental models, and and you were referring in that regard to the mental models of the administrators.
That's right.
And
policymakers.
It made me think about the mental models of the students.
Yes.
And I thought back of that very interesting experience that I've had to visit the school at a time that it was still, as you described it at the beginning of our conversation, and after what I would call its demise, and continued existence as something different. I mean, the shell was maintained, but what's inside the shell was different. But students were still there.
Right, they still had memories.
And they still had memories.
Yeah.
And that second visit I did with Yusra, and we organized or actually it was with the cooperation of the teachers who knew the previous model,
Right.
were helpful in organizing a focus group that we met,
Yes.
and with whom we had a free-flowing discussion. And again, we were flabbergasted by what came out of that group. I mean, their level of personal concern with what was happening, and they weren't concerned about themselves. They were concerned about the others who hadn't had the privilege of being in the
what we
school
had done, yeah.
that they had had. That was very profound.
Yes.
And also we were discussing, because they were graduating students, what are you going to do next? The sort of outlook at the world that they had, their aspirations, their genuine interests. It wasn't about getting the highest paying job, but they wanted to follow their passions.
Yes. Yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
also on the first visit, when they were still sort of the normal kind of students, but normal in an abnormal context, we were already surprised by their level of initiative. When Muriel and I visited, they knew what they wanted, and they were working on things that they wouldn't be working on under the regular curriculum.
That's right.
That's right. And it was their choice to do so, and they loved to do it, and their teachers were supportive of it, and their work and interests weren't interrupted by a bell ringing at a particular time, so now it's time to stop. And fascinating that those things are possible.
Yes.
And
well, I think that's the part for me over these years, is I've had various, and you have too, various projects where teachers, we had an effort in Tucson with elementary schools, and the same thing was there. The teachers embraced this notion of thinking about what they were doing and rethinking it. That happened at West Sac consistently. And most importantly, the students, that they, I mean, to me, that's always been the consequence, is to watch students and their parents who haven't always experienced great success, experiencing it and then realizing the potential of all of this.
It's important to facilitate this, the coming together as a community of teachers and students, and often their parents.
Their parents, right.
I visited a similar experience that luckily has been more successful. This was successful, but also managed to sustain since 1977 in Salt Lake City, the open classroom,
you've mentioned
where it is truly a community of teachers and children and parents, and it's hard to distinguish between who's a teacher and who's a parent. And parents are obliged by the fact that they enroll their kid in the school to contribute, I think, 3 hours per week to participating in the school process, and not in a particularly designed or determined task, but they may themselves choose to do things that they think are important for their children. It's a great example, also like the school that you've been involved in. It's unfortunate that they are very few, but you see them arise and fall, and that will probably continue for some time. I know
when I interact with when we had funders, their question was, well, how are you going to expand? And how are you going to sustain? And the question of expanding never was a key question for me. It was much more, because the culture of a school is so complex that I don't think you're ever done. If we talk about, we had not solved the credit issue, for example, at West Sac. I think we were working on it, but that's a tough one. I think we had much more work to do on that. There were also issues of, well, if kids aren't, and this is part of the industrial model that I think takes over schools, there's an assumption of students working all the time. Well, what's the work? And so one of the issues that the teachers puzzled over is, should they give kids grades for when they're just sitting there thinking about things, even though their projects were meeting the criteria. They were doing investigations. When we had the performances, they could provide and discuss it. But the question the teachers were frustrated about was, well, how is it okay if in between they're not working? And their solution, if they're not working, is to give the kids work. And what happened is kids didn't want to do. I mean, they're happy to try to comply, but it wasn't engaging. And so then the question is, well, why would we have to worry about the work if they're meeting the criteria? But that couldn't get resolved, because then they said, is it fair? Because they're getting credit. Well,
but you mentioned the issue of what was being brought up by funding agencies, how do you expand from where you are? That's a kind of model also, a regular model that people have in mind. But that's not how evolution works.
No.
Evolution works by mutation.
Yes.
And this is a mutant.
Yeah.
And there will be other mutants. It will go on.
Yeah.
But eventually, it's a co-evolution actually.
Yes.
And what we are seeing now, this is a new program that we are setting up in the Learning Development Institute, Human Learning in the Anthropocene. We are becoming increasingly aware of the kind of world that we are living in, and how we as humans are very much responsible for how we manage our habitat, but particularly how we destroy it to an extent that we may extinguish ourselves as a species and many other species with us. So that raises a very important question.
You bet.
What will the people be if we survive as humanity? It's a different, you can't say a different species, but it will be a transformed species. And somewhere in that evolutionary process, I think those experiences that you have had, that I have had, of helping mutants to arise and die.
I can see the cartoon now.
There will be that's one occasion, hopefully, where it takes off.
That's right.
Where a couple of those communities together will actually become so influential that others start getting jealous.
Well, that's what I keep hoping, that some of these opportunities will spawn more, but I was working with some of my doctoral students a couple of weeks ago, and they got very upset because they said, well, what about, so even if you work with a group of people that are compelled, what about all the others? And my own response was, I can't worry about, I can't control. And so I'm fortunate to have this setting with these educators, and let's focus on them. And I don't know what to do about everybody else, but
exactly, it's like a family. You feel that responsibility for yourself, to your own family. But you know that other families do it differently, but we can't help doing that.
No, we can't control it. I care about them very much, but I can't control it. And unfortunately, a lot of efforts in school reform or change is about controlling. The implementation of something, or the fidelity of people putting something into place. So I just feel very fortunate to have had the experience at West Sac, and that the teachers and students, while there were always issues, I think felt compelled and committed and understanding of what their ideas were and how to advance those. And now that's not the way people from the outside always saw it, but they did, and to me that's pretty good.
Yes, those are occasions that are both joyful and painful, and you had them, I've had them,
Yes,
and we have that shared experience.
that's right.
I thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much
much.
for the
Yeah, well,
conversation.
thanks for your
Thank
colleagueship
you very much for your friendship
Friendship,
also.
yes, yeah.